Okay, welcome to this ELEEP Virtual Discussion with the North Carolina chapter of the Sierra Club on coal ash. My name is Andreas Graf, and I'm a researcher on energy and climate policy at the Ecologic Institute in Berlin. I'll be your moderator today. For those that do not know ELEEP, ELEEP stands for Emerging Leaders in Environmental and Energy Policy Network, and it's a dynamic membership-only forum for early and mid-career North American and European leaders working on environmental and energy policy. This discussion today is part of the ELEEP Transatlantic Energy and Climate Dialogue, and it is financially supported by the European Union, the Robert Bosch Stiftung, and the Allianz Foundation for North America. For those watching via the Google event page, you can submit questions by pressing on this green button and typing in your answers. So now to briefly introduce our speakers and the topic. Coal ashes, including coal, fly ash, bottom ash, slag, and boiler dust, are an inevitable consequence of the combustion of coal and lignite as part of electricity generation, in particular as a result of the requirements to meet air emission standards. Much of these materials are subsequently utilized in industrial applications such as concrete and blended cement, where they can lead to savings in natural resources and energy. The utilization of coal residues reaches almost 100% in some European countries, while it is still low in others where residues are often landfilled. Utilization, however, does not ensure an absence of impact. If no measures for safe storage, utilization, and disposal of residues are taken, there is a risk that leachates and runoff from coal residues can result in local pollution of surface and groundwater. The European Environment Agency has said the following on the issue: the environmental impact caused by handling of residues can be low if residues are utilized or disposed of in an environmentally safe way, but unsafe utilization, storage, or disposal has risks of local water pollution. One notable example of this occurred on February 2nd, 2014 in North Carolina, when North Carolina became the site of the second largest coal ash spill in U.S. history, when a stormwater pipe under coal ash impoundments at Duke Energy's retired Dan River plant ruptured. Today we're speaking with Dustin Chicarel-Bayard, who is Director of Communications at the North Carolina chapter of the Sierra Club, as well as Cassie Gavin, who is Director of Government Relations for the Sierra Club there. And today we will discuss the background related to the coal ash spill in North Carolina, how it has impacted local communities, and the broader status of coal ash regulation in the U.S. Dustin, Cassie, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours. So I first hand off to Cassie.
Thank you for having us today. And can everyone hear me all right? Yep. All right. I thought I would introduce this issue with talking about kind of the setting and the situation with coal ash before the spill, then talk about the spill, the EPA coal ash rule, the ongoing lawsuits that have been in the background of all of this, and then what happened this year that has changed. And Dustin will talk about the impacts to communities specifically. So, are we on the first slide?
There we go.
Okay. So this is a picture of the pipe that burst under the Dan River coal plant that caused North Carolina to move forward on coal ash regulation. But to kind of begin with, North Carolina has a lot of coal ash, which is a legacy of burning coal for so many years, just like many other states and countries in the world. There's 120 million tons of coal ash in unlined pits just at Duke Energy's coal ash sites in North Carolina. And there's 33 coal ash pits at 14 Duke Energy sites. Duke Energy is the main producer of coal ash in North Carolina because it's our main utility, nearly a monopoly. There are some other entities that produce smaller amounts of coal ash, but all of our regulation has been targeted at Duke Energy because of their vast coal ash production. So all of these coal ash pits are unlined, and they're all known to be leaking into groundwater and leaking into surface water because they're all next to either lakes or rivers. And all of these lakes or rivers, or nearly all are also drinking water sources at some point. So they provide public drinking water to a lot of cities and towns nearby. And again, North Carolina is not unique in this situation. Coal ash pits are next to water bodies because you need water to operate these plants. So North Carolina had never really taken a hard look at regulating coal ash. Prior to 2014, environmentalists had certainly advocated for the state to do so, but it was not a priority. That's despite several coal ash spills in other states before 2014, including a really big coal ash spill in Tennessee that a lot of people thought would lead to regulation on a federal level and on a state level, but it really did not. So in 2014, we had this Dan River coal ash spill in Eden, North Carolina, which is in the northern part of the state up near the Virginia borderline. That was 39,000 tons of coal ash and 24 million gallons of wastewater that spilled into the Dan River directly and dyed the river gray. And it took a really long time to stop up the pipe that burst, as well as for the river to kind of get back to normal looking. Of course, lots of the coal ash will never be cleaned up. It will just be at the bottom of the river. Some of it was tried to be vacuumed out, but most of it remains. So that Dan River coal ash spill made the public aware of the coal ash storage problem, and also spurred North Carolina lawmakers to action. You can show the next slide. So this is just a funny sort of comment on Duke Energy's position before and after, was that the storage of coal ash was safe in North Carolina, and clearly, that did not turn out to be true, and that was proven by the Dan River coal ash spill. Next slide. So in 2014, there was a lot of public anger directed both at Duke Energy and at the state, and that's really what led to the North Carolina state law that was enacted in 2014 called the Coal Ash Management Act. Wouldn't have happened unless there was so much public outcry, and also the coal ash spill was in the backyard of our Senate leader, Phil Berger, so he had to do something. Next slide. This is a map of North Carolina, and it shows all of the different coal ash sites that Duke Energy has across the state. So you can see they're scattered all throughout the state, and they're all on rivers or lakes. So lots of different kinds of communities affected by coal ash and groundwater pollution and surface water pollution. Next slide. So this is just an example of one of the coal plants, and you can see how the coal ash ponds are right on the lake, Lake Wylie. This is near Charlotte, North Carolina, in the south of the state, and this is representative, really, of how they all are. There's not much space between the coal ash ponds that are full of water and coal ash and the water that's used for recreation and also for drinking water for towns. So you can see how once folks realized this, they're concerned. Next slide. So during all of this, the EPA was looking at a federal coal ash law, but in 2014 there was no federal law yet passed, no coal ash rule yet. What we did have, of course, is the Clean Water Act, but the state law came in and basically set up a classification system and outright said that 4 of the major coal ash sites, including the Dan River, would have to be cleaned up by 2019. And then it set up a process to classify the other coal ash ponds. That process has basically been replaced by something new this year to allow our Department of Environment to classify the remainder of the sites. 3 will be intermediate, and the other 7 if basically if nearby households are provided drinking water and dam repairs are done, those remaining 7 sites, so half of the sites in the state, will be automatically low risk, and Duke Energy will be allowed to cap in place. What environmentalists have been advocating throughout this is that all the coal ash should be excavated and removed to lined storage. So we're getting that in 7 of the cases, partially due to the fact that there's been ongoing lawsuits that have, some of them have now been settled, and those lawsuits will require those 7 to be excavated and ash removed. So that is also in law and required by court order. Next slide. So at this point, we have the federal law, including the coal ash rule, which is self-enforcing, which means we're basically relying on the utilities to do what is in the rule and relying on citizens to enforce against the utilities and monitor that and sue if we think that they are not. The Clean Water Act, of course, was on the books already, and a lot of environmental groups, including the Sierra Club, had sued under the Clean Water Act before the Dan River spill to try and say that the seeps are illegal and to try and get ash excavated and removed. Next slide. Yeah, so now we have some lawsuits still outstanding under the Clean Water Act and also under our state groundwater laws. So those are still going on. And we have the EPA federal coal ash rule that really has just gone into effect that will cause some coal ash to be excavated and removed at some sites, perhaps more than the North Carolina law requires, but a lot is still up in the air. So I'll turn it over to Dustin.
Thank you, Cassie. And I'll try to be pretty brief. One of the things that changed recently regarding coal ash management in North Carolina was a change in law this year that allows many of the sites to be capped in place, covered in plastic, left in their pits after they're drained. And there's a main concern that that could lead to the continuation of pollution at these sites. The reason that's a concern, obviously there are environmental factors. You know, this pollution, selenium, mercury, arsenic, we're talking about toxic heavy metals getting into waterways, polluting our environment. But the reason we have such large public outcry isn't necessarily over environmental issues, it's over people's drinking water supplies. People who live near these coal ash pits tend to live in very rural communities. So it's not the urban setting, it's not going to be, coal ash pits aren't near a city, and most of these people don't have a municipal drinking water supply. They rely on well water. So after the Dan River spill, with more scrutiny, more of a public eye on coal ash and the impact it has on the public, there was more testing around wells within a certain radius of coal ash pits. And what was found is that many of them contained the same toxic heavy metals that are found in coal ash itself, specifically chromium-6 or hexavalent chromium, which is a carcinogen, elevated levels of vanadium, as well as mercury and other pollutants. I think boron was the other one that there's a lot of. So this is what really made the issue relevant for people, is that we are living in a first world country. We live in what many people here in the United States have great pride in our country and how advanced we are, yet the realization that people's drinking water isn't safe near these coal ash pits struck a nerve and really motivated a call to action. One of the changes that happened this year as part of the new coal ash law is that everyone within a half a mile of a coal ash pit is now going to be provided a safe, clean, permanent drinking water supply by Duke Energy, and most of the time that's going to mean running a municipal water supply out to these communities where there's currently not. So that's a big improvement. But that's what really raised the issue of coal ash in North Carolina, made people call to action and really sparked that public anger and outrage, was the impact that this has on people's recreational waters for fishing and swimming, as well as people's drinking water supplies, and the thought of families having to drink and live on bottled water. And there are about 900 families in North Carolina around coal ash pits who have been provided bottled water by Duke Energy that they use for everything from cooking, cleaning, brushing their teeth. And that is something that really was not going to be tolerated by the public, and that's why we saw some action this year to fix part of that law. That's really it for me, and I think we can move on to questions, Andreas, if that works for you.
Thank you. Yes, no, I think that's a great overview and an introduction to the topic for us to get into a conversation. What I would be really interested in, maybe to start with a question for Dustin, is on the local population impact side. You made clear that they were less motivated by broader environmental concerns, or what I would assume are also you meant also climate change impacts or other broader concerns that these issues might have, but rather by the direct impact in their local communities. And I was wondering, what impact does this have on mobilizing action around this? Because you seem to have gotten action on this in the legislature, so there seems to have been enough public awareness about it. But at the same time, if the impacts are so localized, that would generally be something that prohibits action because the impacts don't apply to the broader population. Maybe you could speak about that.
Yeah, sure. So the main issue that the environmental factors weren't motivating is that they were theoretical. They weren't necessarily relevant or in your face. And so, of course, people were supportive of cleaner energy and not storing coal ash near waterways. However, when you have an environmental catastrophe, or when you have people who can't drink their water, that makes it very real for people, and it takes it out of theory, and you have a greater need of action and a sense of urgency. So that helped a lot. I mean, as far as localizing, I think globalization has done a lot of making time and space get closer together. In fact, we're talking here in the United States, you're in Germany. So that the ease of technology, the way the media works faster these days, allows these stories to get out and be told. So it might be a mother in Shelby, North Carolina, who has an 8-year-old whose children are scared to go swim in the pool in their backyard. That's a very local concern, but technology has allowed us to share these things broadly and quickly. So that mother from Shelby, her story, her concerns about her family can resonate with someone all but all over the world, and it can do so quickly. So that's one of the things that help. There is, and I think that's also one of the things that helped legislators recognize that they needed to actually act. No legislator wants to make tough decisions that are going to go against powerful interests in their state. However, when you are dealing with things like people not being able to drink their water, and those stories being told quickly and effectively, it creates a greater sense of urgency for legislators to act as well. I hope that answered your question.
No, I think that was a very useful and interesting response. Looking at Amanda, I was wondering if you have a question, then I would.
Yep. Let me unmute up here. Good. Yeah, I guess I would say one of the reasons I really wanted to participate in this call today was that I had very little sort of idea about coal ash. I mean, it was sort of the first time I had kind of heard about it, and I really wanted to know what the issue was and learn a little bit more about it. So along those lines, I guess my first question is, what are some possible industrial uses for coal ash? Like, what can you actually do with it? I mean, there must be something you can do with it based on all these metals that are in it. And then the second question is, in terms of removal, sort of what is the best practice, or are there certain countries or regions that do a very good job of moving it away and either dumping it somewhere very safely or somehow reusing it?
I can take this one. As far as beneficial reuse of coal ash, a lot is already being beneficially reused. The legacy problem is really the problem in North Carolina, because we have all the old coal ash left over in these pits. So we've advocated for reusing, recycling coal ash like in concrete when it's encapsulated, and that use has been pretty much blessed by the EPA and is being done in different levels. For example, like in South Carolina, they're building reprocessing plants to take out old coal ash from these pits that's dirty and has a lot of different things in it other than just coal ash, to reprocess that to be used in concrete. North Carolina actually imports coal ash to be used in concrete from South Carolina, from other states, even from Turkey, apparently, because the coal ash that's in our pits is dirty and needs reprocessing basically before it can be used well in concrete. But this year, after a couple of years of pressure from groups like us, but also from the concrete industry, saying we can use this stuff, there was put into the coal ash bill passed this year a requirement for Duke Energy to do reprocessing of coal ash at 3 of its sites. So that hasn't begun yet, but that's going to happen, and perhaps there could be more beneficial reuse. Another thing that's being done up in Asheville at the coal plant there is using the coal ash for structural fill, and that's something that we've been generally opposed to unless it's done in a really safe way. And in Asheville, it's basically being wrapped up like a burrito, like totally lined, and then put under an airport to build up the airport and make it flat. So whereas before you could send coal ash all around the state to just be buried wherever without a lot of regulations, now there's some regulations that limit how you can do that. But if structural fill is done in a safe way, like it's being done in Asheville, we've been okay with that. And then as far as moving it, some coal ash is already being moved by rail and by trucks from Wilmington at the coast of North Carolina up to the center part of the state to fill in an old clay mine and make that a lined landfill. So moving it is a big issue because it's a lot of tonnage. We think moving it by rail, if possible, is obviously better than moving it by truck because you don't wear down the roads so much. But less moving is better if it can be done on site, if it can be put into lined storage at the actual site and be removed from groundwater. That's a good thing. So our main ask has just been excavate it, remove it to lined storage away from waterways. And however that can happen, the quicker that can happen, the better.
Can I just follow up to the question then? Are there certain types of coal that make more ash or make worse ash?
I think that there are, but I don't have the details about that in front of me. That's something I could get back to y'all on.
I think one thing to point out about this is we have a greater concentration of the toxic heavy metals in North Carolina's coal ash because of the pollution controls that we have on air. So with all of our coal burning power plants having scrubbers, the arsenic, selenium, and mercury, other heavy metals that would go into the air from the process have been captured, and they remain a little bit more in the ash. So those heavy metals tend to be a little more concentrated in our ash than you would find in coal ash that would be burned at plants without those same air pollution controls, if that makes sense.
So as a direct follow-up on that issue, it's something that I'm really interested in finding out more about. Do you know, especially specifically on this issue of increased coal ash production due to air pollution standards being implemented, whether this is a problem that has essentially has only developed since then to a larger amount, or is it something that we've seen since coal has been used for power generation? To what extent is this kind of a more recent phenomenon also linked to environmental regulations of a different kind, and to what extent is it just a general phenomenon of coal?
I'll take the first cut and let Cassie add to it if that's okay. I think coal ash has always been toxic. I think the more efficient that we've gotten at burning it, there are different problems with that. The main problem is the storage. We didn't know better when we started burning coal to power our utility system and our electrical system. We didn't know that taking the ash and just putting it in a hole in the ground was going to be bad, right? It took us a long time to figure out the consequences, that there's some bad stuff in this coal ash, that it's going to get into our waterways, and that maybe just an unlined pit in the ground isn't the best way to store it. So it took us a while to figure out a lot of the repercussions, but Cassie might have more thoughts about the actual process and if it's gotten worse over time.
No, I think Dustin's basically answered it. It's a legacy problem from burning coal for so many years, that now that we know that storing it this way is unsafe, the debate is how do we clean it all up, and without spending billions and billions of dollars and getting ratepayers to pay it all. So going forward, I think we know that recycling as much as possible and moving to clean energy as much as possible and away from coal is the solution. No matter what we do going forward, we still have to clean up the legacy problem.
I wanted to check in with Anmol, who has also joined us on this call, whether he has a question. You don't have a webcam for me to check. In case you do, go ahead.
All right, excellent. Hey, thanks for the presentation, guys. I was just wondering, and maybe I missed this, I started paying attention after 5 minutes I joined, work stuff. What's sort of the, how much money is Duke spending in making these things okay at this point? I'm trying to get a sense of the damages that have incurred, I guess, to them as a corporate entity. And is this something that comes out of the bottom line, or is this because it's a sort of legacy cost that no one knew was a problem, is somehow being charged back to the ratepayers?
I have some numbers in front of me that can help answer that question. Duke Energy's reports to the Securities and Exchange Commission say that it would cost $6 to $8 billion to excavate and remove the ash from all of the ponds. We understand Duke is spending $4 to $4.5 billion to excavate 7 ponds under court order. So we think that the extra cost to excavate the remaining sites is about $1.5 to $4 billion. So there's been a couple of groups that have looked at this. The Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis says that there shouldn't be additional rate increases needed to offset the cleanup costs. But Duke Energy has been saying publicly that that they think the costs could be as high as $10 billion. We don't think that's borne out based on other numbers that we've seen. But so there's a variety of numbers being thrown around, basically.
And to the second part of your question about who pays for these costs, that's not yet been determined. North Carolina, we have a commission, a utilities commission, that regulates rates and cost recovery for utilities like Duke Energy. Duke has expressed publicly several times that they would like to pass this cost on to the ratepayers. They have not yet filed a petition to recover those costs. I'm not sure if they can do so without actually expending those costs first. Is it they're going to be the utility for not recognizing the problems, or is this going to be something that's passed on to consumers?
Amanda, do you have a question? I'd give you the opportunity here if you do.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a little bit curious, and this is maybe not a question that could be sort of answered in this round. Or Andreas, maybe you know if anyone at Ecologic has looked at this question in the past. What goes on here in Germany? I mean, we have a lot of these. We have a lot of this sort of brown coal being burned here, and if that, I'm wondering if that makes a lot more coal ash or a lot dirtier coal ash, or maybe even less. I don't know. I don't know enough about it. My company never really had a lot of those assets, but I'm sort of curious how it would be dealt with here. That's maybe something I need to research myself.
Well, it's actually something that would have been part of my next question. So, from my understanding, it's certainly not an issue that is talked about quite as publicly, or it hasn't gained as much of a public discourse, partially because we didn't have a large impact event like North Carolina did and Tennessee did, where you can publicly mobilize a discussion around that. And looking into it from the European side, on the one hand, the countries like in Western Europe, like Germany, that have a lot of coal production and have had tight emission standards, air emission standards for a while, have very high utilization rates of the coal ash. And the big argument for them now is we have a whole industry around using these byproducts, and it's actually a positive thing because essentially by having these products, you can avoid the use of other resources that you would raw materials you would need to harvest to go into concrete, to go into other products. So they sell it as something that's a positive thing. The utilization is effective. It's environmentally friendly, and so it doesn't seem to have mobilized, become an issue that people have mobilized around here. And yet, I'm really not sure if that's if it's still something that is impacting local communities quite a bit, and it's just not in the discussion. So, but it would be interesting for me to know what potentially both before the event and afterwards, how was it being argued by Duke Energy why there wasn't a need for stricter standards, and what were the arguments for why not more needed to be done before and after? Just I assume now, as you've explained, part of it is a cost issue now. So they're saying that it's incredibly burdensome, but maybe you could go into that a little bit.
Maybe I could start, and if Justin would like to add anything, he could. I think that before the coal ash spill, basically, Duke Energy is our nearly monopoly utility in North Carolina, and I think they were really trusted as a large corporation to be depended on to safely store coal ash and prevent any such spills as occurred in other states. They were trusted by, I think, the public and lawmakers to the point that there wasn't really a lot of worry or oversight of their records that they were turning in to the Department of Environment and that kind of thing. And then after the coal ash spill, there was certainly agreement from everyone, including Duke Energy, that changes needed to be made, but Duke Energy has consistently argued that closure should basically be cap in place for all of the coal ash ponds in the state, and that means draining the ponds and covering them with some kind of liner or soil and leaving them. And the problem that a lot of environmental groups and others see with that is that it doesn't address the ongoing groundwater contamination issue, so you end up with plumes of groundwater contamination that can impact wells for many miles, and then all of those people use their groundwater anymore and have to get public water lines. So it's a problem that isn't going to go away if you leave the ash in place. Dustin, would you like to add anything?
Yeah. it gets tricky with Duke Energy, and it would be the same with any company for the sole purpose of liability. You know, if the company says, yes, there's a problem here, then it's their responsibility. It becomes a liability for them and their shareholders. And any corporation's main concern has to be to look after the value of their shareholders and their shares. And after the coal ash spill, there's been this wave of denial. Even when wells have been contaminated and heavy metals found, the common line from the company is that many of these things are naturally occurring. There's no way to prove that this hexavalent chromium comes from coal ash, that it occurred naturally. And again, that problem just can be traced back to corporate liability and what that would mean monetarily for the company and responsibility for lawsuits. And there's just a lot of problems around that. And so I think there's always been this denial, and I think that's for most corporations when dealing with issues that their product or their actions have harmed the public or may have harmed the public in some way. The first step and the default is always to deny, because if you take responsibility, there are just consequences that are huge, and those are just scary to bear. And I think that's an issue, if that makes sense.
So you don't see Duke Energy seeing this as a greater threat to its image and its brand by taking a strategy of denial, essentially, because the financial consequences of the lawsuits are higher that they think than the damage to their brand, if I'm interpreting that correctly.
Yeah, so I think the brand, the only thing Duke Energy needs to worry about regarding their brand is how it's perceived by investors. Cassie's mentioned a couple of times that Duke Energy is a monopoly. So they don't need to go out there and vie for people's business, because if you live in North Carolina, they have to provide you power. But it's not like a cell phone where you can go get a different carrier. It's not like television where you can shop around and get satellite or cable or another provider, or like internet. They don't have to compete. They don't really have to save face, except for face for investors, and to show that they are a steady corporation, that they deserve your investment, they can turn you a profit if you're a stockholder. That's the PR value to the company, not really from a perspective traditionally as you think about companies having to deal with public relations.
Anmol, do you have another question? I don't know if you just signaled something or if I misread that.
Yeah, I was wondering, are these legacy costs one of the reasons coal-based power is getting more, or I guess less competitive in the U.S. and other parts of the world? One of the reasons, of course, the abundance of cheap natural gas, which makes coal less competitive. But are these sort of costs also adding to making coal not competitive?
This is Cassie. I would say that they should be included in the cost of coal, but definitely in the past they have not been. So that gives the picture that is cheaper than it is when you don't take into account all these kind of cleanup costs. And now it really depends on what state or what entity is evaluating those costs of energy. And I don't think that still to this day, in North Carolina at least, I don't think that cleanup costs are really integrated into the cost of energy. And if they were, that I think you would get a different perspective on both the cost of coal and the cost of natural gas as compared to clean energies. And some states are doing that, but not us yet.
Yes, maybe that's a good segue for me to ask a question to you, Cassie, about comparative perspective in the United States, and potentially also states that don't now have a big event where a company, as Dustin suggested, might be very resistant to change now because of potential liabilities. What is happening in other states? Are any of are other states much more progressive on this issue? Are some states maybe learning from what's happening in states like North Carolina, learning from mistakes? What is your impression on that? Do you know?
Yeah, there's an interesting comparison between North Carolina and South Carolina. In South Carolina, there have been the same lawsuits targeting the utilities there by environmentalists asking for coal ash ponds to be cleaned up. This was all before 2014, and what happened there is that the state government agencies did not get involved and left it to the environmental groups and the utilities to kind of fight it out. And what they ended up settling on was excavation of coal ash and removal to lined storage. In North Carolina, our state government jumped in between this environmental groups and utilities and basically slowed down that process and argued, that full excavation and removal of coal ash was not really necessary. So we have, more slowly gotten to that point with some of the sites, but it's interesting to look at the two different states and how that was handled. In America as a whole, a lot of other states are facing this issue, but I don't think any other states have a state law that's as comprehensive as North Carolina's. They're, I think at this point, relying on the EPA federal coal ash rule, which allows cap in place for the most part, but may require excavation, removal of coal ash if there's if coal ash is too close to groundwater aquifers. So since that rule is still kind of new, a lot is yet to be understood about which coal ash will be cleaned up and which won't.
One follow-up. I don't know much about about North Carolina's mining activities. Is there a coal mining industry in North Carolina?
No, not at all. North Carolina imports all of its coal ash. Not coal ash, but coal to burn. So you'd think that would make other kinds of energy that we have here, like great solar and wind, more appealing. But no mining of coal here in North Carolina.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting overview, and some of the issues are definitely make me curious to look more deeply into the European situation. When you look at if you search the issue a little bit without being an insider, you come across some of the same documents over and over again from the coal combustion product industry that argue very clearly that coal ash should not be classified as a highly hazardous waste because of the potential cost implications and also the implications it would have for the competitiveness of coal. So I'm now curious to know how similar situations are or how different, and it might be interesting to at some point invite a European speaker to have a contrasting perspective from the industry here, and we'd be happy to invite you if we do that. For now, do Anmo or Amanda, do you have additional questions?
Yeah, I just had one comment. It certainly brings to my mind the question about how India and China are dealing with this, considering the fact they're still building vast amounts of thermal power projects, and they will be over the next decade, especially in India. And given the density of population around these areas and their reliance of groundwater, both for domestic consumption and agriculture, it just, raises a lot of flags in my mind about what they're doing. And I know we don't really discuss Asia too much in ELEEP conversations, but if you look at the bigger picture, if there are, of course, technological solutions that either the US or Europe can bring to mitigate the impact of such environmental hazards, then that's worth probably discussing in this forum also.
I think that's a great point, and you know, that's one of the conversations when you deal with climate change or fossil fuel power is when developed countries, United States and Europe, are saying to developing countries, you need to stop stop creating these greenhouse gases, stop burning coal, stop using fossil fuels. And the counter, and it's easy to say, is that's not fair because this is how you grew. This is how you created your society, and you're trying to stop us from doing the same thing. You did this exact same thing. Why can we not do the same? And the interesting thing is, I think, from a communications perspective, is like with climate change, having the conversation of that we didn't know better, but now we do, is effective when talking to people, at least here in North Carolina. People are really resistant to talking about climate change and saying we have a high denial rate in North Carolina that climate change exists, and that's sad. But it's effective to talk about it when you say we didn't know that this was going to create greenhouse gases. We didn't know the way that we grew and developed was unsustainable. But now we know. So it wasn't our fault. We didn't know better, but now we know better. And when you know better, you do better. And I think that that's the conversation to have with coal ash here in North Carolina. We didn't know storing it that way was bad, but now we know. Now we need to fix it. And it does get into the broader conversations of how to work with developing countries as well, of, well, now we know better. And I think, and this is outside of the realm of the Sierra Club's conversation and our perspective or policies. However, I think something does need to be done to help find developing countries ways to leapfrog the harmful technologies and get them to the place that they need to be and allow them to develop responsibly. And the trick is, how do you put those policies in place? How do you have those conversations? But it's a very real one, and you flagged a very serious concern.
I think that's a very good point. And I was wondering, though, to draw another parallel here, when looking at the issue of water contamination in fracking, I assume fracking activities aren't extremely large in North Carolina because I haven't heard about huge plays there. But are you learning at all from kind of the way people are communicating on that issue when it comes to local impacts, or is it something where you see them being very different situations and ones that are very hard to learn from one?
Cassie, do you have thoughts on this, or do you want me to respond?
I know the answer, but I think you can respond the best.
So we do not have fracking in North Carolina. We've had some conversations around it because we do have some shale deposits. The reason we don't have fracking in and of itself is that we don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the skilled labor. We don't have the pipelines. We don't have what we need to get those operations going. But there are forces here trying to do that. I think the conversation is very much the same. The problem with fracking is that it has the benefit of playing into the desire for many people to have our country be energy independent, not rely on foreign sources of energy. And it could help bridge that gap and help us not have to import oil and natural gas. So there's that benefit there. And so the real conversation is actually trying to get people to take that narrative and that desire and say, yes, you're right, we need to be energy independent, but there's a better way, and it is solar power, it is wind power, it is renewable sources of energy. But I think what we've seen from New York, Texas, Pennsylvania, North Dakota are many of the same concerns, and those are those personal stories of people drinking water being impacted by fracking fluid. And those are valid concerns as well, but it's just not something that we've seen in North Carolina, and hopefully we will never see in North Carolina.
Yeah, I think Dustin's right on. And the other thing I was going to note is that the other similarity between fracking and coal ash is, what do you do with the waste? Fracking wastewater, people don't really know what best to do with it. It's like in Oklahoma, they've been injecting it underground and causing earthquakes. And here in North Carolina, the proposal for what to do with it was to put it in pits in the ground, and that, of course, reminded us a lot of the coal ash problem, and creating a brand new problem like that is certainly not the direction that anyone wants to go. So drinking water, water issues, definitely the same.
Yeah, we just had a webinar on Tuesday where we were also looking at different technologies that are being used to draw attention to kind of improper fracking activities. One being the Frac Tracker app that I mentioned prior to the beginning of the webinar. And I wonder if things like that might be interesting as well and would be easily implemented, where communities could then easily submit pictures and reports of things that they see. It's maybe a little bit more difficult because you have to do kind of more sophisticated water testing. But then there was another scientist who actually has a system for how they do kind of distributed water testing so they can get better data with citizens being involved. Might be interesting for you to look at. But on top of this, on this communication issue again, I would be interested in hearing a little bit again about, you mentioned at the beginning, people really being affected by the thought of their hunting or their fishing practices and their kind of outdoor recreation being impacted. To what extent are you using that and appealing to kind of the hunter-fisher type of person in the communication? Are you working with groups of kind of fishermen NGOs, or I'm not sure how they're organized, but these groups to push these issues forward?
Luckily for us, these groups and recreational fishermen, hunters, they tend to be very active and vocal all in themselves. There's not much, us having to appeal to them. So when something like this happens, they are quick to call their legislators and let them know. The people who have a great value on our public lands and natural resources tend to have a better perspective as far as being stewards of that land and protecting it. That perspective is extremely valuable, and it is one of the few that resonates with the very conservative lawmakers here in North Carolina. I think I'm just very grateful that they've been here. Cassie works more at the legislature and with these organizations directly. She might have a little greater insight about what they've done.
No, Dustin's exactly right, and there are a number of wildlife groups, Ducks Unlimited, Wildlife North Carolina, and they all, definitely get concerned and make phone calls when things like this happen. So that's good when we can have a unified front.
Okay, looking at the clock, we're nearing the end of the hour, so it's time for me to thank our speakers for joining us today and for giving us their time and their insights on this important issue. I've learned a lot today, so thank you, Dustin. Thank you, Cassie, for your insights. Thank you, Anmol and Amanda, for joining as well and for providing your input. And a last thank you to our sponsors, the European Commission, Robert Bosch Foundation, and the Allianz Foundation for North America for making this possible. And with that, thank you to our viewers as well, and see you next time.